Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope you're well. My name is Alex, and this is Slumber Time Podcast. Today, I wanted to do another topic that is a bit more relaxing and, to be honest, quick to write up. The more recent podcasts have had a bit more research that went into them, and so I'd like to keep it nice and simple today. I think instead of doing the more excited style of podcast, I like to get back to the roots of it, like episodes 1 and 2. I'd also like to add I will be taking next week off so that I can prep some more of these podcasts and not be pressed for time like I have been this week. I have about 5 or 6 different topics that I'd like to work on, so I'll be getting to those soon. I think that with this podcast, I'll be doing it in seasons and taking breaks at the end of each in order to prep for the next one. Each season will likely be 12 episodes or so, and that way we'll have about 4 seasons in the year. I'm going to do my best to keep up with this podcast as much as I can. I have no intent to stop. At the very least, it's a good way for me to express myself and my ideas, and I'm thankful to everyone who listens. So, with that taken care of, let's discuss what I consider to be my top 10 favorite movies of all time. Note, I did not say best movies because I love some of them even though they are technically not the best. Also, if you're on YouTube, spoilers for all but one of them. So, without further ado, number 10 is The Haunting. This movie came out in 1963 and was based on the book The Haunting of Hill House. Some of you may have heard of the Netflix show of the same name, and I have to admit that I don't care much for horror usually. The jump scares are a pain, and usually the story can be asinine. However, there are movies that know how to create a wonderful atmosphere. This movie has very few special effects, but those that it does have are utilized perfectly. The way that the house is shot and the music that is used with it gives it a wonderfully creepy vibe. The movie takes its time to build the tension and gives some wonderfully timed scenes. The pounding on the walls scene in it gives me goosebumps every time. It's also one of the best black and white movies ever made. Number 9, Good Will Hunting. Alright, here is a movie that everyone can get behind. Robin Williams was one of the best actors we have ever seen. He was funny and he always had a wonderful, caring tone in his voice. When you pair Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, both of whom I feel get too much flack, in it's probably their best role ever. You get a movie that makes you excited, laugh, and even cry. If I feel like I need a good cry, I'll put on one of the scenes with Robin Williams and Matt Damon in counseling. The "it's not your fault" speech gets me every time. I don't think I can say much more about this movie that hasn't been said, so let's move on to an even sadder one, Coco. I'm going to be honest, this movie completely passed me by when it came out. I didn't hear much about it until some online reviewers really shouted its praise. I know a lot of people loved it, but it was never really my top priority. So, when on a very long plane ride I saw this show up, I thought I'd give it a try. Honestly, the plane was probably the worst place to watch this on because, of course, I was crying throughout a lot of this movie. I can't imagine what the guy next to me was thinking, and the song Remember Me is so lovely, and the connection that Miguel has with his family is very unique, but also very understandable. We're gonna fight with family at times, and I totally get that. However, this movie really made me feel happy, and it may sound strange, but I felt purified. It's like a weight was lifted by the end of this, and I was filled with a lot of love for the world. I highly recommend this movie for a good cry and a great feeling at the end. Also, if you're interested in other cultures, it teaches you so much about Mexico and uses actors with some really amazing skill from Mexico as well. It's my only animated movie on my list, but it is well worth it. I do have to say sorry to my childhood favorites, Aladdin and Mulan, though. Number 7 is Airplane. I have two parody movies on my list, and this one comes in above Coco, but barely, because this is a movie that I can always go back to and bust a gut laughing to. I saw Coco once, but Airplane is one that I've seen several times. Each joke really hits, and I love Leslie Nielsen in this performance. There's so much visual humor in it as well as so many funny things happening in the background that you have to view it a few times before you get most of the jokes. I think you'd be hard pressed to find any parodies in recent years that will stand the test of time like Airplane or many of the Mel Brooks movies. Most of them are usually just pretentious and often just plain ugly. There's no love for the movies or the art on which they're based on, and most people just want to cash in on those popular properties. Although it's not the classic parody style, I think the only ones I can imagine more recently that will hold up in the future are the Cornetto trilogy with Simon Pegg. Edgar Wright is a magnificent director, and nobody can say otherwise. Number 6 is Red Dragon. Now, this movie is often the one that I used to say was my favorite movie of all time. I saw this before Silence of the Lambs, so that did bias my opinion a little bit. If you like Silence of the Lambs more, I can understand that completely. However, I love Edward Norton. His performance here is very intriguing, and it's fun to go through the mystery with him. This was also my first film seeing Anthony Hopkins, and I fell in love with how he portrayed Hannibal Lecter. The Red Dragon villain, if you can call him that, also has a really nice story. You get to feel for him, and he feels very human, and you get to know the guy and the woman that he dates. Buffalo Bill, on the other hand, was, to me, just a crazy weirdo. This movie is also what got me on an Edward Norton movie binge, and I also ended up watching Manhunter because I wanted so much more after watching this movie. Manhunter is the same story with different actors and was done before this. It was done quite well, but I feel that Red Dragon perfected the story, in my opinion. Number 5, many will say, is the best movie of all time, and that's Shawshank Redemption. Many of you may be wondering how this is only number 5 on my list. Well, I will tell you, I don't exactly know. I have weird tastes. Still, I must admit, this movie is nearly perfect. I don't know if there is much to say about this movie, but it gives a very interesting perspective on jail, and from what I hear, it's pretty close to the real experience. I can't really put into words why I love this movie so much, but I can say that the movie focuses entirely on character. The story is there, but this isn't as much about Andy Dufresne becoming an accountant for a jail and then escaping. It's about the characters with their struggles and hopes for the future. For any film student, this is probably one of the best movies to do a character analysis on. The only thing else I can say is this movie had me hook, line, and sinker when you learn Brooks was here. Enough said. Okay, now, don't get mad at me for the number 4 choice, but I think Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is closer to my favorite movie than Shawshank Redemption. I had a difficult time choosing which ones to put in the top 10, which order I would choose, and what I'd put in the honorable mentions. And I think absolutely every person is going to disagree with me, but this is a movie that I have seen more than most other movies, except maybe my number 2. For most people, they would quote Mean Girls, but I would always quote Scott Pilgrim. The story is obviously a bit of a connect the dots one. They just go from one battle to the next, but it's the one movie that makes Michael Cera really funny to me. That's a real accomplishment. I will say that I have a bias because I did date someone who looked a lot like Ramona Flowers, but honestly, it just connected me more to it. For me, the jokes are also really funny. The connection to video games is really cool, and the fights are eccentric but also entertaining. When the first one began with a song, I was definitely thrown off, but I found myself laughing at how odd the choices are. I think you have to be open to humor that's going to throw you off, but it keeps you laughing and entertained. I'll just add that I don't know much about the comics, but I hear they are completely different and even more worth checking out, so I'll have to do that in the future. For number three, I think this is the absolute best parody movie ever made, Spaceballs. I think most people will probably agree with that. I can just watch it nonstop and I will enjoy every last second of it. I grew up on Star Wars, but didn't see this movie until high school, so I had enough time to really get into the Star Wars universe and then have this to turn to later on to really make fun of what I grew up loving. And I loved every single joke. It's such a quotable movie and it's the peak of its genre. If you're a Star Wars fan and never watched this, I don't know what you're doing with your life. And if you're a Star Trek fan and want to laugh at Star Wars fans, this is also great. Of course, Mel Brooks has had some other amazing parodies like Young Frankenstein. I love History of the World Part 1, and Blazing Saddles is, of course, a classic, but this one keeps the jokes coming at a much faster pace and creates a more exciting story for me to keep up with. I feel like the others have a bit more downtime to create more of a story rather than tell as many jokes, and that's perfectly fine. But I think Spaceballs, the reason it's so good is that it uses the jokes to further the story. It's an ingenious way of storytelling, and you'll be out of breath laughing at this movie. My number two, V for Vendetta. This and Scott Pilgrim are likely the movies I've seen the most since high school. I memorized the entire speech about him being a humble vaudevillian veteran, cast vicariously as both victim and villain by the vicissitudes of fate. Now, a lot of people will say the way V is written in this movie is extremely pretentious, but I see it more as art. The way he speaks is not meant to be how most people speak, but rather the peak or pinnacle of human speech. I basically mean that the vocabulary he has is something I wish to attain since so many authors or philosophers have similar puzzling styles, so I saw it more like a puzzle I wanted to solve. The mystery to this movie, as well as the dark topics that it covers, are some of the best reasons to watch it too. If you're interested in like the Big Brother dystopian future, it's a must see. At the very least, the pretty fireworks at the beginning and ending are worth seeing too. This is likely the movie I will continue watching every year on November 5th, and I think many others will too. Just as a side note, I will say that by him wearing a Guy Fawkes mask in this movie, many people are going to be learning a lot more about the history of England and how the monarchy was nearly overthrown. Personally, that gets some extra points in my book for being slightly educational. Now, for my honorable mentions, I think some people won't be too happy with these not being higher up the list. However, these are still some of the best movies I've seen. If they're not on this list, it does not mean that I dislike the movies necessarily, and I might actually do a top 10 of movies that I dislike that everyone loves, but that's for a different time. So the first honorable mention is The Notebook. It's a movie I cried at. Most guys probably haven't seen this movie since it's considered to be a chick flick, but it kept me invested in the characters and the romance, and the ending speaks for itself. I think it's a movie that defined the genre the most in recent years, and I have to give the movie its due. Next one, Life of Brian. I grew up more with Holy Grail, and while Holy Grail is really funny and easy to quote, I think Life of Brian has so much more that you'll notice in subsequent viewings. There are jokes in it that I completely missed or forgot about, and that is something I absolutely love about a movie. Life of Brian also, well, has a lot of life in it. It's colorful, has a wonderful pace, and each scene has something worth quoting. Next one will be Demolition Man. This is an entirely guilty pleasure. I love Stallone and Snipes in this movie, and there's so much cheese in it, but it's totally worth watching just for how fun and dumb it can be. It's like the 90s all in one movie, so it's easy to turn off your brain and enjoy. American History X. This movie's hard to watch, and from the opening to the ending, it leaves such an impact on you that it will stick with you for life. I couldn't put it on the list since I only watched it once, but it definitely deserves an honorable mention. It's one of Edward Norton's best, and to me, better than 25th Hour or Fight Club in my book. Seriously, watch this movie. The next one is probably the most obscure of my honorable mentions, but if you like Anthony Hopkins, The Darkest of Tragedies, and Shakespeare, I think the movie Titus is for you. Most people say that Titus Andronicus is their least favorite Shakespeare play, but for me, this movie moves it up to near the top, right next to Hamlet and Twelfth Night. And I would argue it's the best out of the Shakespeare movies. Next is Clockwork Orange. This movie is insane and in such a good way. I had to include a Stanley Kubrick movie, and this one's my choice. I wish it were higher, but the others had a more emotional impact. But it's a movie that's a masterpiece and deserves the recognition. So, what is number one? Have you ever heard of Fritz Lang? He was an Australian filmmaker and dubbed the Master of Darkness by the British Film Institute. I had never heard of him until an animation had a character with his name. I didn't think much of it until I went through a list of the most famous movies of all time and saw one of his near the top. For me, likely my favorite movie of all time is M. It's not the most riveting nor the funniest. I didn't cry at it during either, and it's all in German, so there isn't as much of a connection. So, why M? The reason for me is Peter Lorre. He became more famous in The Maltese Falcon and Casablanca, but this is the one I will remember him most for. In this movie, he plays a child killer, and there's the mystery of finding out who he is. The moment that gets me the most is when he has a monologue at the very end about how he can't control his need to kill children. It's his nature, and there's nothing that can be done about it. This gets into my determinism versus free will discussion from a couple weeks back, but it captures the feeling so well. He seems so crazed, and I love the depth of his character. Now, this isn't my favorite movie just for that one scene, although it is what pushed it to the top. Fritz Lang was an amazing cinematographer. He was so great at showing and not telling. Just seeing a ball roll into a ditch showed you exactly what happened to a young child. You didn't have to see what happened on screen. That's one criticism of Citizen Kane, for example. They showed too much in the final scene for some people. Here, though, it's just enough. With the Hall of the Mountain King being whistled before most of the deaths, you know something bad is coming. And even after 90 years, this movie holds up in terms of story and philosophies discussed. At the very least, check out the final scene with Peter Lorre. It has such raw emotion that resonates with the actor inside me. So, those are my choices. Do you agree with any of them? What is your number one? I'd like to hear what you think, but I will say I'd be surprised if your number one is ever the same as mine. A small behind the scenes as well. I might do more of these top 10s in the future. If there's any you'd like, let me know. It's very easy to write these, and I'm thinking of doing one maybe for anime, and like I mentioned, I might do one for movies that I think are overrated. I definitely already know my number one for each. Thanks for joining me today. I'll be back in 2 weeks with the next season, hopefully covering some more deep topics. Just remember, we're here and we're listening.